Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm here with Justine Beauregard. She is an award-winning sales coach and strategist, and she's also a podcast host, of course. That's why she's here on the show today. Her podcast is called People Over Profit, and she's been podcasting for a while, so I'm really excited to hear her advice on the show today. Justine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So to kick us off, can you tell me a little bit more about your business? What does it mean exactly to be a sales strategist? And also, how does a podcast fit into that?
Those are great questions. So I actually started my business 10 years ago, but I started entrepreneurship when I was about 5 years old because
Wow.
I had this desire to be in control of my own destiny. And that was really, the way that people value things is through money. And I thought I can have this unlimited potential for my life if I can just control the flow of money in and out of my life. And I realized from a young age that my income was going to be capped in any sort of corporate setting. And my maternal grandmother was a serial entrepreneur. And so I would go after school with my little notebook and I would follow her around in the warehouse of her business and I would ask her questions. And I was just very intrigued by the whole thing. And when I was about 5 years old, I started doing puppet shows in my backyard and making friendship bracelets and starting all these companies to the point where I was laminating business cards and giving them out to people and just really was fascinated by the whole concept from an early age. And so when I got into my college years, I got a job in fundraising and it was really like a sales job, but nobody tells you that fundraising is sales. And so I started doing that job and quickly realized there were ways of talking to people from a sales perspective that felt good and natural that were not being taught as a salesperson. It was always about the scammy, sleazy, pitchy way of selling that was scripted and was enforced by all of my managers and supervisors. And so as I moved through some corporate jobs in the beginning of my career, I really started thinking about how I thought about sales differently and how I could sort of bridge that gap from a sales and marketing perspective and bring those departments together and teach people what is a natural, authentic, feel good way of selling. And how do I teach people that? How do I teach them those skills and what that process looks like and how they could master it quickly so that they could start taking control of their destiny and all of those things. And so I really created the podcast, which is called People Over Profit, because I wanted a way to share some of these foundational principles of sales along with general business growth strategies and kind of a behind the scenes look from the perspective of me as a six-figure earner who works in a coaching space, a services oriented business space, but also getting really incredible guests with different perspectives to come on the show and share their thoughts and opinions. And recently I had an episode where this woman came on who's close to seven figures in her business and creates her whole strategy based on joy as a concept. And so you can find so many amazing connections and collaborations having a podcast where you learn from other people, they learn from you. And in fact, it's like I get a free mastermind every time I have a guest on the show because they're sharing deep insights and I'm asking really pointed questions. So we have this incredible dialogue and we're able to get really to the heart of what those things are that are going to move the needle for us as business owners. And I find that it's basically a free education through podcasting, which is why everybody, I think, who wants one should have a podcast, and everybody who either wants one or doesn't want one should be a listener if they're learning any new skills or trying to level up in their career in any way.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, I'm kind of biased, of course, but I agree. There is so much good content out there, and podcasts are such a powerful way to get that come across to your audience or to consume it, as an
Yes.
audience member. Absolutely agree with that. Okay, so you started your business, this current business, 10 years ago,
Yes.
but like you said, so many other businesses or entrepreneurial projects that you had before that, which is so cool. I love that you started when you were 5. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So from starting this business 10 years ago, at what point did you decide, I want to start this podcast? I want to share these behind the scenes insights and these conversations with my audience?
You know, it's so funny because I actually had, and you could probably find it somewhere out there, but I actually had a podcast before I had a business. And I wrote this book in 2014, which was about having it all as women. And this was before I had kids. So you won't find that book anywhere because probably none of it tracks. Now that I have children, I'm like, whoa, life is so different. But I wrote that book and thought there's a lot of foundational concepts in that book that I can share in an audio format. And I was intrigued by podcasts at the time, but didn't know much about it. So I did this kind of limited series podcast. I think it was 7 or 8 episodes, and I just put them out there and I realized it was so fun to do it. I had such a fun time doing it, and then I kind of let it go. I moved on, created my business, launched, and then I created my first podcast, which ended up being a top ranked podcast called Ask the Marketing Expert, which you can find. And that one, it was really a learning experience. It started off as I know that I want a way to reach more people and be able to show them what I can do for them and actively helping them. So it actually started off as a coaching style podcast where I would get guests on and I would coach them through an issue. And what I quickly found for anyone who's interested in a podcast of this format is that it's really hard to get people to be vulnerable enough to want to be coached on an open forum like that. And none of them wanted to share it. So it
Mhm.
became something that they would find a lot of value in it, but I was basically working for people for free. And then I was having a lot of trouble getting the word out because none of my guests wanted to actually share, like, this is a struggle and I got coached on it live. So I changed up the format. And then I decided after so many years of doing that, I think it was 2.5 years or so that I ran that podcast. I kind of came to an interesting transition in my business where I had to decide, do I want to rebrand this show? Because I'm really focused on sales, not marketing. And it was Ask the Marketing Expert. So I didn't want that title to stay, but I wasn't sure like what I wanted to do at that point. And I realized I needed to just have a fresh, clean start. So
Mhm.
I announced on the show that I was going to be stopping it and it was going to be the last episode. And then behind the scenes, worked on the new podcast. And I thought about how I didn't want it tied to my brand or to my offer names, because if anything about my brand or my offer names ever changed, I wanted the show to be able to live on its own. And that's when I thought, what am I really trying to get to here? And I thought my whole brand is about people over profit. It's about the people, the experiences, us, ourselves, our goals, our dreams. And then it's also about the math and the sales and the numbers and the things we need to know to be successful. So I created the concept and kind of sat on it for a little bit. And then I thought, I think it's ready. And I actually launched it just by myself. Every episode was 15 minutes. It was very topical, very laser focused. And just about a few months ago, I decided to open it back up to guests. Once it became a top 5% show, that was the point where I felt like I'm getting enough reach now and I'm getting enough expertise in how I run this formula. I think I can bring other people in and make it that much more explosive. And it's worked so beautifully that way because I waited to a point where I could get really good quality guests booked on the show who are, 6, 7, 8 figure earners who have real deep insights, who, when I wasn't even ranked, wouldn't have looked at my show twice. And so I felt like that was such an important distinction to kind of hold. And then once it became top ranked, to be like, hey, I've got something people are paying attention to. It's got thousands of downloads. Let's, figure out how we can collaborate with each other.
Absolutely. You said some really interesting things just now. I just wanted to highlight a few of them. Um, One is that you weighed it, right? Like you had patience in starting this new show And yes, you started from a clean slate, right? What you said, but you did have the experience from the other podcast,
Yep.
right? So you're definitely starting with like that's all that experience that you have as a podcast host because you've already done the interviews. Did you also do solo episodes
I
on
did.
the,
Yep.
okay, solo episodes as well on the other podcast. So you already had all that experience, all that knowledge that you brought into the new podcast. And then just having that patience of, okay, I'm going to build this up by myself and make it really, really good. And then, very strategically bringing new people in, bringing guests in to spread the word more, getting more eyes on it, but also getting more opinions on it and new insights on it. I think that's really cool. And I think that's really difficult as podcasters to have that patience.
Mm.
How long would it take you? Do you have an estimate?
How long did it take me to become top ranked?
Yeah, before you
On this
started
show, about
having
a
guests.
year.
A
Took me about a
year.
year.
Okay.
And I think what's really interesting is when I was launching this show, I first paid for a few sessions with somebody who had a top 1% show. I wanted to meet with them and really pick their brain about what they felt was the most important part of their formula to grow. So that was really helpful in just getting some feedback on even like my intro and how it was structured. And, people want to hear this first and then that, not this and then that. And so
Mhm.
I would flip things around. And then just thinking about, one of the pieces of advice they gave me, which I didn't take, was have guests from the start because it's going to help you exponentially grow and reach more people because you're going to tap into their audiences. And I thought to myself, my background is in sales and marketing and it's justifying the ROI. And ROI isn't just a return on investment, it's also a return on time and energy. And I thought, as myself, being at the level of business I'm in, I don't want to be on brand new shows with 12 listeners. Like that's not a good use of my time as a business owner. And I think that there's value in figuring out what formula works for you before you get other people involved. Because every time I have guests, of course, they have opinions on how a show should be run and, what types of questions and things. So I really wanted to get to a point where I listened to enough guest interviews on other people's shows and listened to the interviews that I did before and really think about it. And also from an editing perspective, I was paying a lot of money a month to have an editor working on my show. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. And I realized the better way was getting better guests who didn't need to be edited, who knew exactly how to answer questions, who had a ton of expertise that it was easy for the conversation to flow. And automatically, I went from spending hundreds of dollars a month on editors for episodes to spending almost nothing because the edits were so minimal and the experience was so much better and the insights were so much deeper that it just became really easy and fun to do the interviews and to get a ton of value in a short amount of time.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting way to look at leveling up your podcast because it's something that we don't talk about a lot, right?
Yeah.
That getting better guests, probably also becoming a better host, right? What you said that you
Oh,
listened to
yeah.
a lot of interviews that you did. And through that experience, you can also ask better questions. You can ask the questions in a better way as well.
Yes.
At least I can definitely see that in my own experience as being a podcast host. It just becomes easier to just choose the words, literally.
Yes.
Like it just does. Just to know what to say and how to ask it. Okay, so that's something that you did to figure out what works for you and for the podcast, right? Can you share a little bit more about what you looked at exactly to see what works? When is the show successful? That's a question I get from clients or potential clients all the time. Like, what should I be looking at?
Hmm.
So, in figuring that out, was there anything else that you looked at? Did you look at download numbers or any other kind of stats or analytics? Or can you share a little bit more about that?
I think what's even more important is what's not important. Like I spent with my first show, it took me a long time to become a top ranked show. And I think the reason why is because I was focused on a lot of the wrong things. Like I was really obsessive about what day of the week to release my episodes. When in truth, nobody listens the day they're released. you need to get people listening all the time when it's convenient for them, and that's the benefit of a podcast, right? Like, very rarely do I wait until the second of the day that someone releases a new podcast, and I'm like, "Okay, I blocked my whole calendar just to listen to this show," because I know it's gonna be there later. And so I was really obsessive about doing these deep analytics with my first podcast on what's the best day of the week to release an episode to make sure I maximize listeners. And the truth was, I found out there was none, and that I have podcasts I listen to on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for different reasons. And I listen to all of them religiously and I love them and I never miss an episode. So those little details were things that I'm like, why do I care about this? Why do I care if it gets released at 5 a.m. or 7 a.m.? Like, it doesn't matter. But
Mhm,
what I did realize for me was, what is going to make this podcast easy and fun to run, so that I can do it for an exceptional in a long period of time. Because
mhm,
what I found with my other show was that the way I was doing it with so many guests, which is why I have 4 episodes a month, so one a week. And one of those 4 is a guest episode, and the other 3 are still me. And the
mhm,
reason why I do it that way is because if I do all guest episodes, I will quickly burn out because I'm an introvert. I can't be on that many calls. I can't deal with that many edits. All of those little pieces, it was like, it's going to be too much for me and I'm not going to have fun doing it. So I'm not going to do it. Doesn't mean that having guests every week isn't valuable or a great format for other people, but that's where you really need to know your personality. Like,
mhm,
what do I need to make this a fun show? For me, I love listening to shows that are conversational and a little bit longer when it's something that's more casual. Like, I love the Smartless podcast for that reason. It's just a fun,
mhm,
carefree interview style show. But then I also love really actionable, deep insight type podcasts that are either like, and maybe their interview style, like Diary of a CEO is a great one, where he'll interview like the CEO of, or the previous CEO of Netflix. That was a great episode. I loved listening to the insights. But I also feel like there's a ton of fluff and backstory and things that I don't need. And I wanted to create something that was sort of a happy balance between those two things, where you get those actionable insights, but it's not shrouded in a cloud of fluffiness or backstory. You really just get to the heart of it and you figure that thing out, and then you have an action step you can take. That's my style. So figuring out what your style is and the things that feel important to you to have a show that you would listen to, that you would find valuable. And fun fact, this is going to sound totally egotistical, but I promise it's not. I listen to my own show as if it's not my show. And I actually go, whoa, that was a good point. Like, I should be thinking about that. Because usually the things that we share are things we ourselves need, but we don't think about or we don't spend the time to sit with. And so, even just creating the episodes and drafting out what the content's going to be, I'll have to go back and listen to, you know, other things that I've done or things that I've said or insights, and I'll dig deeper on them. So there's a lot of learning just to create the show. And then there's a lot of insight gained from listening back as if it's not mine. And it's really helpful to get different perspectives. So I would say, look for the things that are going to help you enjoy the process, but also things that you would be an avid listener of your own thing and that you wouldn't be bored or, frustrated or feel like you were left hanging on some topic or concept, because your audience is going to feel that 10 times more.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm hearing you say is that, there were things that were just unimportant. What time of the day and which day you release episodes, who cares? As long as there's new content and people can listen to it, they'll be happy.
Yes.
But then what is important is the actual content and that it hits home for the audience. And that's why you're listening back to your episode, so that you can listen to it as a listener, as someone who's not hosting the show, and then see, like, does this actually work? Right? Like,
Yes.
am I picking up advice here? Am I getting those tips? Am I getting those action steps as well? I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of people don't do that. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't really listen to my own episodes. Um, but it makes sense. Like, you want to make sure that you get better as well, and that you check if the listeners have a good experience.
I will add one more thing to that too, which is it became a practice to listen back to my own episodes when I started creating more social media content to share the episodes, because I go back and listen. At first, I didn't do it to learn. That just was a byproduct of it. I first went back to listen to find the best snippets that I could share on social media. Like, ooh, that insight was really good. Or, ooh, I love the way that I just said that. And that's about a 30-second clip. So that would make a good reel. Like, little episode snippets are where I started. And that got me to be like, why am I not just, these are 15 minutes long. I can listen to them when I'm in the shower. Like, I'll just pop it on while I'm in the shower. I'll have my phone running with it on the background and I'll be listening and I'll go, "Ooh, that was good." And then I'll pause it and I'll like voice record a note to myself. This is the spot that you want to do a snippet for. So I'll be listening for those, but I'll also be listening to learn. And sometimes I'll write down questions that come up, but most of the time it's to find those little timestamp moments that I can then go share later to promote it.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of podcasting as well, right? You can multitask. Like you
100%.
can do this while you're driving, while you're in the shower, while you're, I don't know, grocery shopping. You can do all of that
Yeah.
while listening to a podcast. So that's really cool about this channel specifically. What else worked really well for you and for the podcast? Can you share more that you feel like people who are starting a podcast now, they definitely should do?
Yeah, I have found, and this is a little bit of a biased opinion or perspective, so take it with a grain of salt, but I have found that it's not, I see a lot of people create podcasts to build an audience. I think you need to build an audience to have your podcast be successful and use the podcast to build an audience at the same time. It needs to be both. It is not just like this lead gen machine that you publish an episode and then all of a sudden people are finding you and flocking to you and the whole thing is growing. Part of the reason why my podcast became a top ranked show so quickly, well, in my mind, a year is quick, but maybe for some people, they're like, oh, that took a long time. I really thought about how can I get this out to my people? Because I have a super loyal audience of over 10,000 people. I knew if I shared this in enough places with my people, I would get that foundation of listeners a lot quicker. For anyone who's interested in podcasts, I wanted to share it. So I started sending out emails about the podcast when it was released. I sent out little reminders to people to go listen to episodes. I would have multiple posts on social media pointing people to the podcast. I created a podcast highlight on my Instagram. I talk about the podcast when I go on other podcasts as a guest and when I'm networking and people say, how do I learn more about you? Start with my podcast. It's got a dedicated page on my website all about the podcast. When people, and actually it's interesting, I sort of feel like a local celebrity sometimes because I'm in a few networking groups locally and they have events. And I went to this event probably about 6 months ago and I was networking with people and someone came over to me and go, "Are you Justine?" I go, "Yeah, I am. Hi, nice to meet you." And she goes, "I listen to your podcast like every single week. I wait." She's one of the few. "I wait until Monday when you release a new episode, and it's the first thing I listen to in my day. I'm so happy every time an episode gets released." And then somebody else goes, "Oh my gosh, is that Justine?" And by the end of the event, I had like 5 to 10 people, which doesn't seem like a lot, but in a group of 50 people, it's a decent percentage. I was overwhelmed because everybody knew my show. They knew about the podcast. They were excited to meet me. And it's one of those things where you feel like really taken aback because it's your voice, right? Like my photos on the cover and things like that, but it was just the way that people talk to you. They're just like, I feel like I know you because it's such a good
Yeah.
way to connect with people and they feel your emotions when you're talking to them. And it felt like we had been lifelong friends. And it was such a cool moment to be like, this has created new friendships. It has created new connections, new clients, new partnerships, all of those beautiful things. And that's why it's important that you use the podcast strategically to grow your business and grow your audience. But it started taking off because I had that foundation of really loyal fans who would listen to anything I put out there and who would take the action steps and get the results and rate and review the show without me even asking. So at this point, I've got I don't know how many, close to 30 5-star reviews. I don't have anything below 5 stars as a review on the show. And whenever someone sends me a DM on Instagram and they say, "Oh my gosh, I love this week's episode of People Over Profit," I always respond and say, "Thank you so much. And if you haven't yet, can you please copy and paste your message and put it as a review on iTunes?" And every time they go, "Absolutely, I would love to do that." And it's a quick way to, instead of just saying thank you or instead of saying like, "Oh, that's great," and moving on, every time someone compliments you, ask them to rate and review the show because it really does help it to grow as well.
Yeah, that's so smart. And I think it makes a lot of sense what you said, that a podcast is a great nurturing tool. But as a lead generation tool, I mean, you still need people to find a podcast. And if you would have started your podcast 20 years ago, then yes, you could have just released an episode and people would just magically find it because there were barely any podcasts out there. So for lead generation, it was perfect. And you could grow a show just by releasing content.
Yeah.
But nowadays, 2024, that's just not reality. So it's way more of a way to engage your current audience. And then also when you get in front of new audiences, to share the podcast with them so that they can get to know you really quickly.
Yeah.
So as a sales expert, as a sales strategist, is sales easier after someone listens to the podcast and they go on a sales call with you?
100%. Yes. I mean, here's the thing. Learning how to be great at sales is all conversation based, right? We need to learn how to have conversations. You don't just need to learn how to communicate because that is singular, like I'm speaking to a group of people. Conversation is I'm engaging in a conversation with people. And the thing that's so special about a podcast is that it feels one to one. It feels, when you're listening to a show, especially a solo episode, I write and record them as if I'm talking directly to you. I'm not saying my clients do this or I've done this or this person should do this. I'm saying, so you have a business that is doing X, Y, and Z. Here's how you should think about X, Y, and Z. And I'm really talking to them as if I'm sitting down having what I call a cafe conversation. Like we're having a cup of tea or we're having a coffee together and we're just talking about business. So it feels very personal and intimate. And I think that creates automatically, especially on their side, which I can create that very quickly on my side as an experienced sales coach. But I think on their side, it already opens up the rapport. So closing the sale is so much easier. And my close rate was already high. But since having the show, it's 90% plus. Like almost everybody I talk to says that they've listened to at least one episode of the podcast, and they're always a yes at the end of a sales conversation. Very rarely are they not a yes. And there's other factors that go into that. Like I'm very transparent about my pricing and I have great sales messaging and I am a sales coach. So I follow the practices I teach people. But I think it's really important when you're creating the podcast, when you're creating any podcast, to think about how it can be a sales tool and how it is a part of your sales funnel. We're building these assets because we want to grow, right? We wouldn't have podcasts if we weren't trying to grow our businesses more likely than not, right? Like these are sales tools and these are marketing tools. And so we need to be thinking in advance and at a high level, strategic level, how does this fit into my business? And if it's not part of your funnel, if you're just doing it for fun, you need to think about that a little bit more and what that means. Because if you're doing it for part of your sales funnel, then you should be promoting it when you're on other people's podcasts and out there in networking groups and sending emails and doing all the things that I'm doing with my show. Because when people ask me, what is your sales funnel? Most of my sales funnel centers around, I have one or two sales funnels, and the podcast is one of them because it converts so highly into customers. And I don't even promote my offers on the show. I don't talk about how I work with people or invite people or have like ads running on my show at all. It is literally just people listening to it and going, wow, that was helpful, putting it into action, getting some benefits, reaching out to me and saying, this episode was helpful. This is what I created. And I say, great. And then I move them into a sales conversation and they close. So thinking about how you use your podcast strategically. And part of this too, and this may sound a little bit woo, but I think it's important to say, is we can diminish that by telling ourselves, I'm just doing it for fun because we feel bad that we don't have a bigger audience listening to it yet, or we feel like, oh, it hasn't quite grown yet. So I'm just going to tell people it's a passion project, and I'm just going to like make it super casual, low key. And I'm not going to overly promote it because it's not quite where I want it to be, or I don't love the format yet. But the only way you're going to grow with it and get feedback from it is to put it out there aggressively. And so flip that if you can. If you are somebody who's telling yourself like, oh, I have this baby show and I'm just trying to do it as like a fun thing and we'll see where it goes. No, make it an intentional part of your business strategy. Really get aggressive with how you're sharing it out there. Don't just send one email one time, send a weekly email when you release episodes. Don't put one piece of social media content out there to share it. Share 5 pieces of social media content. Like, that's the volume game you have to play with marketing that's going to give you the exposure you're looking for, give you the feedback. And worst case is you get a bad review. Somebody doesn't click on your link, right? And those are also great because you're going to learn from what that bad review says about the show. Maybe they don't like the format. Maybe they say something to you and it just sparks you to innovate something that makes it a top ranked show that much quicker. These are all experiences that are scary. But if you're putting yourself out there in any way for your business, you really need to give it 100%, and you really need to make it a core fundamental part of the business. This isn't just a passion project. It's not just a fun thing that you do. It's fun and it's a passion project and it's a part of how you grow your business. And we really need to start treating every asset we create from a marketing or sales perspective like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we just, as business owners, there's other hobbies that are even more fun.
Yeah.
But as a business owner with a podcast, better make it work, because it can have so many beautiful results for you and for your business. Like what you shared, that these sales conversations are easier. Even though you are an expert in sales, like it gets even easier for you with this podcast, because it's such a trust builder for an audience. They know you already. Like you said, people come up to you and they feel like you're friends because they listen to you every week.
Yeah.
I mean, how cool is that? But the only reason you have those results is because the podcast has been a priority, right? You've been focusing on it. You've been consistently working on it and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and taking all that knowledge that you have from the last podcast and all that experience with you into this new podcast. And you're super strategic about it, which is amazing to hear. Justine, thank you so much for sharing your podcast experience with us today. Please share where people can find you and the podcast before I let you go.
Yeah, so you can definitely search for People Over Profit. That's the name of the show, and it's on all the major platforms. And you can also find me on Instagram at Justine Beauregard Coach, or my website, which is justinebeauregard.com. And that has all the previous episodes of the podcast on it, and some of the reviews and different things you can look at to see if it's the right fit for you to listen to.
Perfect. Amazing. We'll also have all the links in the show notes, so you can also click there. Definitely give Justine's podcast a listen, People Over Profit. Thank you so much, Justine. This was amazing. And I can't wait to now, after this episode, go listen to your podcast, because then we know what to do once these people who we now have listening to our new podcast, once they book a sales call, now we're going to learn from you what to do next. So
That's
I think that's a perfect next step.
Thank you.
Amazing. And thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. All right. That's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.